Welcome back, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today for the national meeting for the BWC TTA program. My name is Rachel Johnston, and I'm the program manager. Our next session is Improving Police Research and Training, Integrating Data from Body-worn Camera Footage into the Workflow with Dr. David Makin and Megan Parks from Washington State University's Complex Social Interactions Lab. And now I'd like to turn the session over to our presenters. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to your comments. Dr. Makin?
Thank you, Rachel. And again, thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to sharing what we're doing out here and our work with agencies. I'm going to turn this over to Megan, who's going to kind of introduce the agenda for today's talk, and then we'll kind of start diving into the material.
Okay, so hi everyone. First, we're going to introduce the Complex Social Interactions Lab, or the CSI Lab, by discussing the mission that it was established under, the goals and benefits of the lab, and introducing the research team that has really contributed to the development and ongoing lab efforts. Then we'll talk about why the work conducted in the lab can really be leveraged to address specific gaps in the research. And one of those specific gaps in the research that we want to talk more about today is related to de-escalation and how body-worn camera footage can be used to actually operationalize de-escalation. We then want to talk about the coding approach used in the CSI lab to deconstruct the body-worn camera footage, and then really highlight the importance of capturing contextual factors in the coding process. We'll then introduce some of the in-field and developing projects that we have going on in the lab, and talk about ways in which this type of data can be integrated into the workflow. And we wanted to end with a discussion on what departments need to know prior to starting these types of projects. And lastly, something that we find extremely important that we wanted to talk about more today is really gaining an understanding of what departments want to know from this type of data.
Thank you. So I guess to give you a brief background, I was pretty fortunate to start my career at the Southern Police Institute as a graduate student. So I had a Master's of Science from the University of Louisville. And one of the things that stood out to me was really, policing is complex, right? That there's benign interactions, there's intensity, but by and large, when we think about decisions that are made, we tend to only focus on the outcome, right? And again, this is normative, good or bad. You can also think within policy or out of policy. And let's see, probably almost a decade ago, started looking at body-worn camera footage. This is very early on, right? Before Axon, the kind of proliferation of all the these different technologies. You start looking at these recordings, right? And you see there's a lot of detail that were in them. And yet, when you would talk to agencies, they very rarely looked at these, unless there was something that was the negative that happened. And then as body-worn cameras started to emerge, we started to see technology being developed. You started to think through, what do we know about policing? What do we know about police interactions, police decision-making? And we had a fair amount of knowledge, but there was kind of these gaps, these kind of critical questions of, well, what was happening situationally, contextually, what was happening? And so the idea with the lab was really, if we had agencies that we'd been working with and they had body-worn cameras, was what could you learn from them? What could we extract from that footage and make data, objective data? And that's really how the lab came to be. The idea was if we could study, right, these interactions and amass, a volume of data, because that's what this is. This isn't just footage, it's data. It's zeros and ones, that we would be able to better understand decision-making, better understand when, errors were being made. You could study interventions. You could finally know if we trained officers to do this very specific technique, are they using it correctly? When are they using it? And as we started to develop the lab, and as we started to onboard agencies, we started to look at and have these conversations around, well, how would you like to use your footage? And so I think it's incredibly important that the agencies that we work with, and we've been fortunate to sign on 2 large urban departments, 3 small police departments, and we have 1 medium police department right now that's onboarded into the lab. And they always had different it wasn't even kind of the variation on what they would want. They all kind of had similar goals. They were like reducing risk. It was, thinking about officer health and wellness, trying to understand if a specific type of training was working. And we started to see that sometimes they were diverse in what they would want. For example, we really want to study our use of force. So, okay, we can do that. We'd really like to understand, incivility. And these are some projects we'll talk about in a moment. But at the core, they wanted to understand really what was happening within their interactions. And at the same time, they'd always say, we don't have time to do this on our own, or we don't know what to pull out, what to extract out of our interactions. And so with the creation of the lab, and as we were able to increase the number of researchers, today we've worked with over 130 research assistants that are in the lab, and they are processing footage, right? They are coding exactly when all of these events happen. And something that I think is, and we can probably skip a few slides here. When people realize that, we've been able to process, thank you, Rachel, 15,000 hours, it's incredibly important to realize that, one, we have to add that we were completely shut down because of COVID, right? We could not operate a lab and be in compliance. We couldn't. So here, but we will be able to reopen in the fall. But as part of this, when you think about what many of you, you're learning from your programs, and I would challenge you to consider how frequently are you using the data, right? Not just watching the footage, but collecting data out of it. And what we know from reviews is that agencies are very rarely, it's less than 5%. And it's often because you don't know what to collect. And so as we built the lab, as we started developing projects with agencies, and a great many of those are published, was really taking that step back. And so what I did here is really try to highlight what are the more pressing projects that we're trying to work with agencies to understand. One is really about stress. You'll notice that there was just a release on officer health and wellness, all this funding out of the COPS office around helping improve officer wellness, right, and health. NIJ for years has had, right, these programs on funding for health and wellness. We've had studies that have tried to use cortisol, and in so many ways, we're trying to think through what can we extract out of these data to understand and contextualize stress. You'll see, research that's happening in many agencies right now, where you're having Fitbits or other types of biometric data collection efforts, but they're not being contextualized. And so one of the things that we have been doing is, collecting biometric measures of stress and then connecting that to what was happening, right? So you take that body-worn camera footage and the data that's extracted out of that, and then you overlay that with the biometrics. So you can better contextualize those changes that are observed. And what we're trying to understand, again, if we know that stress impacts decision-making, we know that time of shift. We have a wealth of research that shows us all of these, these kind of affective states can have an impact in decision-making. Well, once we can better study that, right, you can understand and contextualize, and then hopefully from that, build better intervention programs. One of the things that we're really interested in exploring is there a way to be able to intervene as you detect some of these different types of states, so that you might simply make an officer better aware of what's happening? But even then, you have to be very careful when you have these types of interventions. So imagine something like a haptic feedback, that as you start to become much more stressed and you're starting to emote more, that something alerts you to let you know that. Well, it seems like a great idea. Let's just have this intervention. But before you do that, you need to put it in a small scale experiment in a very safe area so that you don't inevitably try to experiment in real life situations that can have potentially detrimental consequences for different parties. And so there is a slow methodological way that you have to build these types of programs. And so one of the things that we'll also talk about here today is being very mindful of those that are trying to sell automated techniques. We processed 15,000 hours of footage, and we've done so very carefully, while not simply trying to use NLP and other types of technologies that are not properly contextualizing or validating, right, what is observed in those interactions. So again, be very mindful, that as you see all these different technology, just kind of go back to what do you want to learn from your footage? How will it help your agency? Just collecting data for the sake of collecting data, we can all do that. It's really a matter of what do you want to learn and how is it going to help your organization, be it improving health and wellness of officers, improving the use of de-escalation, having better applications of use of force. So much of this, again, is really being able to identify what is a very clear gap. And right now we know we're still not, after a decade of body-worn cameras, we're not operationalizing that data. We're not making that footage into data and then using it in an effective way. So we want to start with a little bit of kind of background in a study we've been doing on de-escalation. So we've been building arguably what is the largest use of force repository. So all of these different agencies that we're working with have been sending us all of their use of force. And then we start processing those data. Now, as Megan will discuss in a moment, kind of how we code these data, it's easier to think about it's entirely objective. So it is, did this event occur? When did this event occur? And how long did this event occur? Now, what this does is it starts to generate a timeline around an interaction. Now, in terms of de-escalation, something you are all keenly aware of is that we fundamentally have an idea of what de-escalation is. But if you had to create an instrument, right, to watch footage and go, yep, that's de-escalation or that's a non-escalation practice, we'd get all types of different answers. And we've done this with officers that we've asked them to self-disclose where they believe that they've been successful. And then we have our coders look at those and they don't pick up on any of those techniques. And we have a whole litany of different types of techniques that coders are taught, right? And again, they watch them independently and then we compare them so we get a nice inter-rater reliability. And then we'll have other officers watch the same footage and they don't pick up on it. And so what we've been really thinking about here is how can we better identify what does de-escalation look like? What does non-escalation look like? What are some of those techniques? And to do that, we started now really carefully thinking about what types of instruments are out there. And so when you look at that kind of state of the literature, what is it, how have research studies, those that are from academia, those that are from, practitioners that are talking about de-escalation, we really found, that the Price and Baker framing really kind of identifies core themes, right? And we won't spend a lot of time on these. I just want to show you that these themes align with what are very objective elements. So if you think about theme one, all of these effective characteristics are really about procedural justice. And you'll see them even framed that way. Did you tell the person the reason for the contact? Did you state your name? Did you verify their information so that you're speaking to the correct person? Did you explain the reason for the interaction, right? These are very objective elements. It's either you did these things or you did not. And so as we build out this kind of instrument for studying de-escalation, at the same time, again, you have officers that are self-disclosing that they believe that they were highly successful, and yet you don't see any of those techniques that are commonly discussed. And that made us kind of even more question and go, okay, well, what are they seeing that we're not seeing? And so in amassing this database of use of force and then non-use of force, we're really trying to understand, what are some of those common techniques? So makes it very much inductive as we identify these different patterns. And here Megan is going to talk a little bit more about our coding process. But I want you to really take note of that far right side where we have focus on objective events, because the way that we do this is really, is for us, right? It's for researchers so that we can understand and have strong interrelated reliability to be able to run our statistical models, to make predictions, right? To really set this up for a machine learning approach. But at an agency level, you can do the exact same process, because it's really just a matter of, did something occur, right? Yes or no. When did that something, whatever it is you're looking for, occur? And so you can integrate this into your workflow, but I do think it's helpful to understand our approach. And so I'll turn this over to Megan.
So this diagram here is, like he said, it's an overview of what our annotation process looks like to track those events that are occurring in the footage. So first, we train the research assistants on how to use the coding software, which involves quite a few hours of training, going through practice videos, and a lot of back and forth between the lab manager and the researchers, just to make sure that they're understanding and coding those variables correctly. Then in some cases, videos have to be screened by the lab manager prior to sending them out to the researchers to start coding. And then once that front end work has been completed, the videos get assigned to pairs of coders. The annotation software is structured in 3 different tiers, as you can see there. And just to briefly kind of go over what that means, tier 1 captures whether the event occurs, and if so, at what time point it occurs in the footage in minutes and seconds. And then tier 2 captures the duration of and other contextual information associated with those events. In addition to capturing that other information, tier 2 also encompasses a different annotator who verifies the information that was presented in that tier 1. Lastly, tier 3 then captures information associated with the end of those events occurring in the footage and any changes associated with those events. So as in tier 2, tier 3 also encompasses a different annotator who verifies information presented in both tier 1 and tier 2. So collectively, these 3 tiers really provide a temporal sequence of events that's verified at multiple stages in the process. So again, as Dr. Makin mentioned, the variables in the codebook focus on objective events, which is something we really reiterate with the researchers. They're coding whether or not an event occurred or not, and the time at which it occurred and the duration of its occurrence. In terms of the software needed to put this process into practice, Excel is completely appropriate for baselining efforts. We also use Microsoft Access to simplify the data entry process now that we've acquired so many variables in our codebook.
Thank you for that. I think oftentimes when we share, we had to develop a custom software to essentially code all this footage. We often had things we had, not for us. But you can absolutely do this, with Excel. And we have an agency that could not, partner with us. They just couldn't figure out a way to get enough buy-in to share out footage with us. And I think I shared this at the last time I spoke with this group back in, pre-COVID. And it really was just a matter of their use of force. He said, okay, we want to learn from our use of force. Well, what should we collect? And he said, okay, just a couple measures, right? You can put them in an Excel spreadsheet, just that. You do use of force reviews? Yes, we do. Every use of force gets a supervisor review. Okay, so get yourself a spreadsheet, right? Name it whatever you want. Here's all the data points you want, right? In addition to all the normal officer information, and right is just how quickly in the interaction did the officer use force? So what's the first point of contact, right? Just mark the time point. First point of contact where the officer makes it known that they're on scene interacting with that individual, right? When is force used? Put the time point. That tells you how quickly, just those 2 points, how quickly in the interaction did that force occur? What is the type of force? Right? Was there an additional type of force? And then you got to, right? Yes, there was. Okay, what time? Right? and then the duration of all that. So you take just those measures, and beyond just your normal use of force review, was it in policy or out of policy? What you have now, if you do this and you build it, so in the first 10, not really that helpful, right? You're not going to find patterns. But the more you do this, you're going to get a baseline for an agency or a shift. And what you then can do is it gives you actionable data to have a conversation where you look and see that, interestingly enough, here's Officer Johnson, right? And notice that you are substantially quicker in using force than everyone else. It doesn't imply that there's something wrong with that officer's decision making. There might be a reason that they are quicker in using force, right? But as you start to collect these data, it gives you something that you can have that conversation on. You can start to think through, well, why we have in certain types of interactions, officers, the segment of officers are significantly slower. What about those particular interactions? And for us, this is my segue into context. We use audio analytics because that helps us get at intensity of interactions. But at the same point, there's a lot of vendors in this space that will sell you an NLP solution or a video analytics solution. By and large, it's the NLP variety, right? That, we can show when de-escalation occurs. Now, remember, I just told you there's no validated instrument around what de-escalation is or is not. And yet vendors are already telling us that they've cracked the code for being able to understand what de-escalation is and when it's applied. So you have to think through, what are you extracting and what is valuable from that extraction? Does it also contextualize the interaction? And for us, we are deliberately slower in our coding process. And I should add, I didn't add this because I wanted to get to the Q&A part of this, is that all the agencies that we work with, we're not for profit, right? I actually should say we don't charge anyone anything, right? It really is about, we're a research lab. So all of the agencies that we work with, we work on answering agency questions, right? They're not David or Megan or Dale's, questions around what we want to answer. They're really about, what does the agency want to learn? We build a research project out of that, and then we work with the agency to answer that question. And so for us, it's slow, it's deliberate. Again, we've been at this since 2016, and we only have 15,000 hours because we code for over 130 events. And sometimes they seem silly. Why? Did the person change from a standing position? How often does that absolutely? Well, we need to have it, right? Or directed profanity, or slurs, directed slurs. We have less than 1% of all of our footage has a directed slur. It just almost rarely happens, but you still want to collect it. So we've really been very careful about thinking through context so that we can better understand what's taking place as we extract data out of those interactions. So here's just a quick sample. So I talked about use of force or de-escalation, so I won't spend too much time on that. But we had an agency that was particularly interested in understanding their COVID context. They wanted to understand how officers were relaying that information to the community. They also wanted to understand, that the conversation that took place, were they handling, providing PPE to individuals if they didn't have any? How was the community receptive to that? And so we ended up building a supplemental kind of instrument specific to this agency, again, because they wanted to learn something from their interactions. The same thing for incivility. We had a chief that said, I really want to understand what one-on-one interactions look like. I don't want to understand, if there's bystanders. And I said, can you figure out a way to give me a baseline on how frequently my officers are directing incivility? And to give you so for us, we don't code profanity, right? We code directed profanity. Now, some of our people, well, why don't you do profanity? Well, we were developing a project with the NYPD, and they said, well, we cuss all the time. Project never materialized. We didn't get to do it, but we learned a very valuable lesson that sometimes officers like to use colorful language. We all do at some point in time, but directed profanity is really where incivility, where it kind of rests, right? So that means you're directing it at the person. Same thing with, slurs or interruptions, right? And so we built this out, and then we were able to give this chief back. Here's a baseline. So here's how frequently your officers direct incivility. Here's how often they are first in directing it, because it can be reciprocated, right? You could have a community member that is, they're just swearing up, right? Why are you such a, they're just laying it. So does the officer respond in kind? Again, the way we code data, we get to show who's first, and then is it reciprocated? Is it only the officer is engaging in civility? And we could show, here's the results for you, chief. Here's where it varies. So does it vary by gender, contact type, race, location? So you could see the variability. And incivility is incredibly, again, it's not a complete picture of incivility because there's lots of different variations on how people interpret incivility. For us, we built a very basic instrument that had been used for decades. And we were able to say, here's how frequently these things occur. And what was particularly important about this is the chief was very quick. He said, that's untenable. My officers should not be using directed profanity. So this, again, isn't just, oh, shit, that's not it. It's, why are you a shithead kind of a thing, right? Like directed at that person. He said, there's no defense to that. So we're going to have a retraining and have a conversation on how we speak to people, and we don't respond in kind. We have to be above that. And I thought it was a very powerful moment to look at. Here's footage that we then made data, and then they were able to make a decision, right? Retraining, having that conversation with officers on what is expected of them when they have those interactions. And I should add, since we have research on emotionality and we've published on that, it really does speak to, I think all the officers here can attest, is that that if you respond and you kind of escalate your emotional state, kind of your affective state, it tends to pull other people up. That's how human beings are. Unless you learn how to regulate that, right? It just kind of escalates. We can't be doing that, right? We have to be able to maintain, right, that professionalism. And right now, we have this project that we're trying to produce a randomized control trial with. This one I thought was kind of interesting, and it came out of this group's talk pre-COVID, when I had a bunch of officers and they were asking, they said, should we tell people that we're recording them? And I said, I don't know. I don't. And it became very frustrating because I would get emails. Should we be telling people? When should we be telling people? And I kept saying, we don't know. If you look at Cynthia Lum's study, she said, we don't know. We've studied it, but we've been struggling with, I don't know. And so we started thinking much more about this. We reached out to some folks, and we got some agencies to buy in. And so we proposed this RCT to study this enhanced notification statement, to kind of get at this idea of, is it how you state that, the recording? And so that's what we're trying to study. And we developed this by looking through our footage, and that when officers kind of made this statement, it was really around accountability and transparency. I'm recording this for you. If you would, want access to it, access will be provided to you. Here's how to do that. We noticed that those interactions seem to be a little bit calmer. But we can't state that because it's not an experimental condition. It's simply a pattern that we've observed. And so we built what would be the first RCT around studying this statement. This is our current project, and this is substantially more challenging. And this is really around, what do you want to learn? do you have an observational instrument, right? You have FTO instruments. They're there, right? You've had those for decades. Now, can you take those and make them objective? If you really think through that scale, that rating of how well they did something, people tend to do very well, right? Well, changing it to something that is objective is much more difficult, right? Because then you have to really think through, what do we want to learn? And so what we've been working with two smaller agencies on is building these KPIs, right? And they can vary. So you have, an IPV KPI, right? These are objectively, I'm just going to throw out a number here. These are 7 things that in every type of IPV, you have to do these, right? Traffic stops. Here are 7 things that absolutely we expect all officers to perform when they make a traffic stop. And that's a little bit more difficult. Like, you think it would be easy, but we've been working with these agencies for about a year, and they're still kind of going back and forth of, what do we want to collect? And then how do you integrate that into your supervisor review? I think something that we've learned is really, it's got to be random, right? And it's got to be explained to officers that this is not a, I gotcha. Absolutely, this is a better way of thinking about this is, we want to learn about how excellent you are in your interaction. We want to understand where you were phenomenal in maintaining, regulating your emotional, that affective state, despite the fact that this person is, they are in such a high intensity, right? Like, you did so well doing this. If you make it about, and you build your instrument around the compliance, because that's really what this is. It's kind of a hit rate compliance. Don't focus on the negative. Focus on, we need to learn from interactions. We need to identify better practices. We need to understand how officers who were able to have 100% compliance, despite the fact that this person just did not want to listen to them, right? Learn from your successes as opposed to simply focusing on, well, you missed this one. Really make it about a learning opportunity, to throw a little educational pedagogy in here, make it about a growth mindset that you can be better. It's not to imply that you're poor. It's that you can be better. You can also get officers to do this. So in the agencies we're working with, I'm trying to get officers to go in and identify what they did well, right? So take those objective events and have them add a little bit of around why they were able to do that so well. Again, learn from this. One of my first research projects was understanding how an agency implemented their programs, but more importantly, how officers were learning from those interactions. And something that stands out to me, and Megan actually went on a recent ride along where they talk, like, learning from those interactions, going back and kind of, it's weird to say deconstructing, right? Like, watching your footage and going, I should have done this. Or, oh, wow, I don't know why I did that. But I'm going to be more mindful of that in the future. But doing that unprompted, right? So that a supervisor wasn't standing over you, trying to figure out a way to kind of organically bring this in to your workflow so that officers are learning from interactions that, as you are, integrating that in, that it's just a part of a process, that it's all about learning how to improve as an organization, to be more efficient and effective at what you do. I honestly don't know how frequently and how many. So these last parts, we don't know. There is simply not enough research. We're not learning from organizations, that have been able to integrate this into workflow. Listen, we're in the process of implementing this in an agency. So it's going to take us a while to be able to even identify, well, what do you get for doing this, right? Does it help improve your organization? Does it reduce risk, liability? What does it do? Right now, we're simply setting up, here's hopefully how you can integrate it in, how you can randomize, how you can get officers to go through and review footage, right, without it becoming burdensome. Because I think that's what many of you all struggle with is, how do you do that? Right? How can you make this data, but not assign an FTE, right, to doing this? Because nobody has the resources. Megan, did you want to speak about this?
I can hop in on the practical considerations.
Absolutely. So we have an FAQ that is posted to our lab website. This is essentially the common questions that we get from agencies. And so we just decided we'd write them all out. And it's pretty, I will tell you, it's pretty long. And my answers they're pretty long-winded as well. But the idea here was really to just let agencies know kind of, here's who we are, here's what we do. We don't charge you, right? There is a data use agreement that we have to go through, and it takes a while. We spent about 6 months in our Attorney General's office going through this process so that we could onboard agencies. What is so absolutely critical, and if there's anything that you leave with today, is I want you to really be mindful of what do you want to learn from your footage, right? Because that's what allows us to develop tools, right? Different technologies, instruments, even if it's something as basic as a pre-configured Excel sheet that we can give you that you can start filling out to generate data so that you can have those conversations in your organization. You know, it's, again, for us, I know for a fact that we would not have the level of trust from agencies if we went to them pitching that we could solve their problems, or if we went there pitching our ideas. That has never been what we do or who we are. It's about, what do you want to learn? And we'll figure out a way to make that happen. It's slow. I'm going to tell you that right now. It is absolutely slow. But I like to think that it's free. So if it's free, it's going to be slow. But it needs to be, right? I think if it's something that's urgent, we'll figure out a way to make it happen. But by and large, most agencies are pretty comfortable. They recognize that it might take 6 months to a year before they get an answer. But when you get an answer, you know that it was done in a valid and reliable way. And those results are your results. I'll leave you with one point. I'll have Megan talk about some of the practical considerations. One of our first projects, an agency, they had some claims that they had bias in their use of force. And so we went in and we analyzed, and we were able to come back with it. Your data does not show, in terms of, again, we're looking at body-worn camera footage. And so we're looking at all their use of force. And we coded all of it. You don't have bias in the application of force. But your officers are substantially faster with community members of color. And what stands out in that, the interaction is the chief said, "Tell me why." And that's what all this is about. You get data, you see it, here's the patterns, here's what it is. And then the question that, at least what inspires me, the agencies, they are progressive. They all want to get better, right? And for that chief to say, "I need you to tell me why." And that's been our experience with agencies, is that they genuinely want to improve. They just need some assistance, because honestly, none of y'all got time to sit down and do what we do. We had 25 researchers COVID, we'll throw that out, that are in the lab working. And we process, again, a volume of data, but it's really about what agencies want to learn. And so, Megan, practical considerations.
Yeah, just to touch on a couple of these practical considerations, that as the lab manager, I kind of see not really the back end, but not necessarily all of the technological aspects of allowing data access for the coders. But one of my roles is to really ensure adherence to those IRB and privacy protocols that the researchers have to abide by in order to access that data. And that is obviously, first and foremost, very important and super time consuming. But that does take some time. And then coders and code books is just to kind of reiterate that developing those code books and those variables should be, around something that's one that the department themselves want to learn, and then using research to kind of support those variables that you're collecting data on as well is always helpful. And training the coders takes time. So that's just another practical consideration. It takes quite a bit of time to ensure that they are understanding the variables correctly and interpreting them correctly when they're watching the footage. And then, yeah, Dr. Makin, if you want to touch on that department review and external review as well.
Yeah, I think the review time to onboard agencies, it does take time, right? Because there's, we need to be able to create samples of your interactions that allow, and truly are random, so that we have better confidence that what we're giving you is a more accurate baseline of your agency. So we spend a little bit of time discussing that. I will say that we meet CGIS, I should say it's CGIS compliance, but no one really, just meet the conditions, not so much a certification. But it's a secure facility. And I'm happy to spend, have some offline conversations around that. But by and large, if you skip to the next slide, this is really about the last thing we want to leave you with is, thinking about what those key performance indicators are, right? And having a conversation with your officers, your supervisors, your community members around what objectively we expect, as well as what we don't expect to see there, where we don't expect to see directed profanity. So it's both, it has to be objective. And I know there's always efforts, and we've had an agency that really wants things on a Likert scale. How well do we think the officer did? And I will always push back. It's not our job. It's not our role. Maybe there's some set of researchers that would love to review and score these on a Likert scale from 1 to 7 on how well an officer did. For us, it's really a matter of did they do it, right? Because you can present that. That's objective. It happened or didn't happen. How well it happened, we can explore that. But for us, it's got to be objective. And so I want you to think through what objectively do you expect to see and not see in interactions, and creating a general code book, right, or a general KPI can be done, but then it's really limited. You really want to think through specific types of interactions in what you expect or don't expect. And so I think we have our intimate partner violence study, I think, is one of the most profound in that area. Because it really was about an agency, a very large agency, that wanted to understand. We put our officers through a series of trainings that had all these expectations around what they would be doing. So, for example, referring victims to services. And so we built an entirely objective code book around that specific type of interaction. So I'll end that here. I think the next slide simply has our contact information. And certainly open any questions that you all have. And thank you again for allowing Megan and myself to come in here and share the research that we've been doing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Makin. So we have actually, and Megan, thank you so much, both of you. So we have received a few questions that I wanted to pose to you both. So the first one was, in the 15,000 hours, how many of those hours were events found to have taken place with the length of interaction and end results?
So again, since they're random, they have a variety. So we have arrest, non-arrest. We have, so they're all criminal complaints. So they're either officer initiated because they believe that something has occurred, or they've been dispatched. So it's kind of dispatch initiated or officer initiated. So they all involve a criminal complaint, which may or may not involve an arrest. Time, they all vary. It's amazing to see the variability in contact time, as well as, we didn't add, we code when another officer shows up, right? So this is part of what takes us so much time, is that when another officer shows up, that's a change contextually in the interaction, right? So now you have what that officer is doing or not doing, right? And you have to build that out, which makes, this is one of the reasons I say that what we do is inherently complex, thus complex social interactions, because we code for what each participant in that interaction is doing, right? So if you have a bystander that is walking, approaching the officer, closing that distance, we code that. If you have a bystander that leaves the interaction, we're going to code that. So what you did is we like to call it, it's really a 360, it's everything, right, that took place that we get to observe. Of course, if officer's looking this way, we're not capturing that. However, if you got another officer's viewpoint, you can then supplement that and really understand everything that's happening. That's incredibly difficult from a statistical analysis perspective, which is what's taken us a lot of time to work through and solve, because it's kind of, in a weird way, it's kind of like nested interactions, right? So you have an interaction with an officer, with another officer that shows up at a different time point, and then you have bystanders, and so you're trying to make sense of something that's pretty complicated. And so that's a long answer to it. They vary in in length. Sometimes they can be as short as a minute. We've had interactions that are, an hour long. So I hope that answers it.
Thank you. We had another question about, are departments allowing officers to review their own video as a learning tool?
So the agencies you work with, yes. They encourage officers to be able to review as kind of none of them have a formal self-assessment. And I'm not quite certain how you would integrate that in, how to best do that. I mean, I have some ideas on it. But I think that, I said, some of that early research, actually my first research study that dealt with body-worn cameras, really did get at, those officers that were doing those self-assessments. They were going in, it was very organic for them, right? No one told them to go and review. They were doing it because they wanted to learn, what they did, if they could have done it better. And I think I'm always impressed by that.
Thank you. Another participant asked, he was curious if there's a difference in interactions and civility by the size of the town or city. Have you all been able to determine that?
It does seem to vary. We need to code considerably more. So as we onboard agencies, we did our last onboarding effort pre-COVID when we were shut down. So we have, I don't know, probably 1,400 use of force interactions that are just kind of sitting in our repository that we haven't been able to touch yet. So yeah, I would say that it seemed, at least from the study that we just did, it does seem to vary by location, which is always fascinating, right? Because you always think about place kind of dictates behavior, right? Like you go into an interaction, an environment, you might carry yourself a little bit differently, or maybe lessen some of those regulations, kind of over how you might behave in that. And we do see that in our data.
Well, I believe there was just one more question that someone had about if it would be possible to obtain that spreadsheet. I'm not sure exactly what spreadsheet they are discussing. Commander, if you want to place in the chat what spreadsheet you were looking for. Okay, there's another question. Are you familiar with similar research being done by Professor Raymond at UCSB? And if so, how would you compare the findings?
So I am not familiar with that, but happy to take a look at it and kind of explore the methodology. And in terms of the spreadsheet, it's the use of force. Yeah, happy to send me an email. Happy to send that over. Just kind of extracting some of those key points. For us, I think that we're now moving into NLP, and we're doing so because we understand context. We've learned from these 15,000 hours, and now we're trying to slowly integrate NLP to figure out what is valid and what's not. And then if we can reliably extract data out of this. One of the things that, just again, be mindful of is whatever you see, whatever you're gonna use these data for, again, go back to, what do you truly want to learn and what's the best way to access it?
Well, I just want to thank you both so much. This was such a great presentation. We had a lot of really good interaction with the grantees. So thank you all, grantees as well, for participating.